One introduction RZFV, the United States government was on track in the Biden administration to reduce the prices for both clean energy heat pumps and clean energy electric cars. Trump tariffs are expected to upset those plans to prevent future air pollution and prevent climate change. The United States government should, instead of certifying wood stoves as safe when they are not safe, go forward with regulations that ban wood stove use and direct government money for use of forest refuse only. For home building and furniture building, for just a few examples of use of forest products for non-burning uses, it is well known from scientific and medical research that wood burning is a substantial source of PM 2.5 emissions, yet the wood burning industry uses the scientifically debunked theory named carbon neutrality of wood burning to argue that wood burning replacing coal burning in industry, and in a trickle-down argument that wood burning should continue for home heating should continue. Presumably because it is called renewable, wood may be renewable in the sense that a tree can be planted in the place of a cut-down burned tree, but it takes centuries or decades for the newly planted tree to attain the stature of the cut-down burned tree. During those centuries or decades, photosynthesis, which converts CO2 to oxygen and so sequesters some carbon, will not take place at the same rate as photosynthesis was performed previously, and wood burning emits both CO2 and PM 2.5, and PM 2.5 is not absorbed by trees, so PM 2.5 is not diminished by planting a tree in the place of a cut-down and burned tree. In fact, a living tree closes its pores against the presence of PM 2.5 from nearby wood burning, just as humans hold their breath in the presence of PM 2.5 from nearby wood burning. And when a tree closes its pores, the level of photosynthesis that absorbs CO2 pollution goes down. Wood burning emits 90% PM 2.5 particulate matter of 2.5 micrometer size, the perfect size to infiltrate the human lungs, setting off a cascade of human health problems and early deaths. Contrary to many beliefs, wood burning emits 2.8 times the PM 2.5 as the fossil fuel coal burning, and wood burning emits 450 times the PM 2.5 as the fossil fuel natural gas burning. Replacing coal burning with wood burning creates more air pollution in the form of CO2 and PM 2.5 than coal burning. This emission data comes from testing the cleanest burning wood stove in the United Kingdom, the Eco-Design Wood Stove, and International Convention does not count the emissions from wood burning. The emissions from wood burning are erased from all countries around the world when calculating if each country has met its climate goals. This non-counting or erasure of wood burning emissions data from climate goals does not mean wood burning emissions do not exist. RZFV purple air PM 2.5 monitors hanging from the eaves of the house of a near neighbor should be used to measure the level of PM 2.5 in the air hyperlocally in the yards of near neighbors of indoor residential wood burners. If PM 2.5 levels exceed World Health Organization standards of 5 micrograms per cubic meter annually, then that evidence of air pollution from wood burning should lead to the shutdown of that indoor residential wood burning appliance, one appliance at a time if necessary.
Hi, my name is Lily. Andrew gave you the intro to Residents Against Wood Smoke Emission Particulates and their concern for air pollution from indoor residential wood burning. Residents Against Wood Smoke Emission Particulates, or RZEP, would like every near neighbor of an indoor residential wood burner whose wood smoke enters their yards and sickens the near neighbors to have a purple air PM 2.5 monitor hanging from the eaves of their home to measure the level of PM 2.5 entering their yards. That measurement of air pollution should be used as evidence of unnecessary air pollution, and each indoor residential wood burner should be shut down based on that evidence, one indoor residential wood burner at a time if necessary. The presentation by Andrew ended at 2 minutes 5 seconds. The same presentation by Emma starts at 2 minutes 3 seconds before the end of this podcast. So I am Lily, your timekeeper, and you can start the next podcast at 2 minutes 5 seconds in if you would not like to see the presentation by Andrew a second time. This presentation by me, Lily, ends at 5 minutes in. What you will see in the main content of this RZEP podcast will be news about air pollution from indoor residential wood burning and how that air pollution is being combated by ordinary people just like you who are unfortunately near neighbors of indoor residential wood burners at this time. There will also be news about unnecessary and highly polluting use of wood as fuel in industrial wood burners and preventable air pollution from wood burning wildfires. There will also be news about air pollution from PM 2.5 from gas-powered cars. There will also be news about airborne diseases which are also preventable with vaccines such as COVID-19 and measles and whooping cough, to name just a few. In 2025, Residents Against Wood Smoke Emission Particulates is also concerned with combating the Trump destruction of government funding for programs which protect human health through the Department of Health and Human Services, and Trump destruction of programs which fund the science and medical research plan to protect human health from preventable illnesses. Protecting human health is a patriotic act, and our defense against enemies is weakened if we are not as healthy as we can be. Heat pump rebates are now offered by the federal government, distributed through the eligible United States, are available in 2025, and are the best, cleanest, and now cheapest alternative to indoor residential wood burning if that burning is actually done to purportedly save money. Wind and solar as sources of the electricity that powers heat pumps and electric cars is also cheaper than burning wood. The adverse health effects that are caused by indoor residential wood burning also come at a cost to near neighbors, both in shortening and ending their lives, and in actual hospital, clinic, and funeral costs. Instead of being compensated monetarily, near neighbors should instead be able to achieve immediate relief by stopping indoor residential wood burning in their hyper-localized neighborhoods, which relief readings from purple air PM 2.5 monitors used as evidence of air pollution will help them achieve. Welcome to news about hopeful scientific and medical achievements that will also help us achieve the goal of clean air to breathe.
Webisode 57DHYAFZXV February 1st, 2026 Wind and Solar in Maine, Australia, and Germany. In Webisode 57DHYAFZXV, the United States, California, Illinois, Maine, Rhode Island, Vermont, Washington, D.C., Wisconsin, Australia, Germany, and Russia, some embracing clean energy, and some resisting. 1A United States Trump prefers climate change critic to replace Jerome Powell at the Federal Reserve. 1B Kevin Warsh is against greening the financial system. 1C United States, some research has indicated that climate change is already curtailing economic growth. 1D United States Trump and Republican governors, 13 eastern states, and the District of Columbia energy experts said that governors and legislatures have tools to keep electricity prices from rising further and might even be able to lower them. 1E United States reduce or reform utility profits. 2 California Give Consumers Rebates. 3A Illinois Superfund Laws already passed in New York and Vermont. Make Polluters Pay week of action across the country, including in the states of Connecticut, Colorado, California, New Jersey, and Maine. 3B Illinois, the Make Polluters Pay Movement. 3C Illinois legal challenges to the Make Polluters Pay Movement even outside Illinois. 3D Illinois affordability crisis from costly climate change effects on utility consumers. 4A Maine onshore wind power. Onshore wind power will be generated in northern Maine, but for use for which parts of Maine? 4B Maine Northern Maine and its relationship with Nova Scotia Canada. 4C Maine a potential wind powerhouse. 4D Maine Who Benefits. 4E Maine. 2nd Vermont, Rhode Island, and Connecticut have joined Massachusetts and Maine in expressing interest in buying a portion of the new power generated via this Maine project. 4F Maine Solar and Wind are the least expensive. 4G Maine Affordability in northern Maine compared to the new Brunswick Province of Canada. 4H Maine on Wednesday, January 28, 2026, a Superfund bill in Maine was voted out of committee and will proceed to a full vote in the state Senate. 4I Maine The Election Ahead. 5 Rhode Island this month, a climate superfund bill was introduced in Rhode Island. 6 Vermont, the Vermont Superfund Act. 7 Washington, D.C. On Monday, a councilmember in Washington, D.C. announced a bill to study the financial impacts of climate change on the city and potentially require compensation from fossil fuel companies. 8 Wisconsin Geothermal clean energy. How are they promising renewable energy that Democrats and Republicans actually agree on? 9 Australia, the offer of free electricity when there is a surplus. 10 Germany encourages home solar and batteries. 11 Russia Russian oil revenue, the lifeblood of its war machine, is plummeting. Maine content. 1A United States Trump prefers climate change critic to replace Jerome Powell at the Federal Reserve. Rosep view this Trump pick would have to be approved by Congress. Back to the article headline, the Trump pick to lead the Federal Reserve could steer bank away from climate change. Kevin Warsh has criticized central bank forays into climate change. Some activists and Democrats say the Fed has not done enough. Excerpts edited by Rosep for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates, a 501c3 nonprofit organization. Inside Climate News, January 30th, 2026. This success of proxy season companies against activist investors surged. Major corporations like Bank of America successfully dismissed several proposals related to the disclosure of greenhouse gas emissions during this proxy season. More than 100 protesters arrested in New York City while calling on the Federal Reserve to end fossil fuel financing. Climate protesters blocked the doors to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York on Monday as an NYPD police officer with the Strategic Response Group, which specializes in large demonstrations, crowd control, and major events center watches over the demonstrators, and another officer arrests a protester heading for a second-term Fed chair. Jerome Powell bucks a global trend on climate change. The fight over control of the Federal Reserve has revolved around interest rates and inflation, but the Trump choice to be the next chair of the central bank could sway how the agency assesses climate risks too. In a speech last year to a group of financial leaders that was broadly critical of the Fed, Kevin Warsh called climate change a politically charged issue that the bank would do better to avoid. Warsh previously served on the Fed board. 1B Kevin Warsh is against greening the financial system. Excerpts edited by Rosep for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates, a 501c3 nonprofit organization. Inside Climate News, January 30th, 2026. An example of a politically charged issue Warsh gave was the Fed joining and later withdrawal from the network of central banks and supervisors for greening the financial system, a group that aims to strengthen responses to climate change and includes most of the major central banks of the world. The Fed joined the group ahead of the Biden inauguration 5 years ago and withdrew right before Trump took office last January. There is broad agreement among economists that climate change is affecting the economy and poses risks to the financial system, but there is debate about whether or how that might affect the work of central banks like the Fed. Some economists within the Fed have argued that climate change poses broad risks to financial stability. Banks could be exposed if storms or extreme weather cause bankruptcies, for example. Already insurance companies are withdrawing from some markets due to worsening wildfires and damage from coastal storms. 1C United States, some research has indicated that climate change is already curtailing economic growth. Excerpts edited by Rosep for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates, a 501c3 nonprofit organization. Inside Climate News, January 30th, 2026. The Fed Board of Governors has published research on these risks. Its mandate is to maintain price stability and to maintain employment, and climate change is clearly relevant to both of those things. So the Fed would be, in my view, violating its mandate to not at least study those things. Many activists and some Democrats have criticized the Fed for not doing more to address climate change. The European Central Bank in particular has taken more steps to try to limit those risks of climate change. In 2023, the Fed and 2 other agencies issued guidelines for financial institutions on assessing their own climate risks. In October 2025, the agencies withdrew the guidelines, saying they were not necessary because existing rules required banks to examine a range of risks, including emerging risks. Trump has sought to roll back climate-related regulations in the financial sector. More broadly, the Securities and Exchange Commission is seeking to withdraw rules that would require greater climate disclosures from publicly traded companies, and it has recently worked to make it harder for shareholders to press companies to take action on Climate change and other issues taken together, the moves are making the financial system less transparent and less stable, said the chief executive of, as USO, a shareholder advocacy group. The regulations are to reduce risk, Behar said. 1D United States Trump and Republican governors, 13 eastern states, and the District of Columbia, 3 hours of free power and other ideas to lower utility bills. Energy experts said that governors and legislatures have tools to keep electricity prices from rising further and might even be able to lower them. ROSEP. This article does not enumerate the steps Republican governor are thinking of taking. They may only be issuing a press release saying they are somehow going to address affordability. The steps taken by Democratic governors and Democratic states include acting as state officials to administer the existing federal program that helps low-income families pay heating and cooling bills. Excerpts edited by ROSEP for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates, a 501c3 nonprofit organization. The New York Times, January 31st, 2026. President Trump and Democratic and Republican governors this month announced a plan to build power plants to lower electricity bills in 13 eastern states and the District of Columbia. Energy experts said that even if the plan works, the plants will take years to build, but they added that governors, state lawmakers, and utility regulators could do a lot of things that could have a big impact on energy costs a lot sooner. Electricity prices have soared recently because of fast rising demand for energy from residents, businesses, and data centers used for artificial intelligence. The national average retail rate was 5% higher in November from a year ago, nearly double the overall inflation rate. The average household spent $178 a month for 1,000 kilowatt hours of electricity, according to the Energy Information Administration. Costs are expected to climb further because recent very cold weather and winter storms drove up the wholesale prices of electricity and natural gas costs that utilities will pass on to residents in the coming months. About 17% of Americans are behind on their electric bills, according to the National Energy Assistance Directors Association, NEADA, which represents state officials who administer the federal program that helps low-income families pay heating and cooling bills. The anger is growing, said the executive director of the Energy Assistance Directors NEADA organization. You are seeing much higher rates, and they are not coming down. But the NEADA head and other energy experts said states can keep prices in check or even lower them. 1E United States reduce or reform utility profits. ROSEP view the middle ground between helping utility executives or helping consumers would be to cap utility returns on costs for equipment and power lines paid by consumers to between 6.5% to 7.5% of monthly consumer utility bills. Excerpts edited by ROSEP for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates, a 501c3 nonprofit organization. The New York Times, January 31st, 2026. Most U.S. electric utility companies are monopolies, and state governments have a lot of control over how much profit they earn. States typically allow utilities to return to investors about 10 to 12% of the money they invest in their electric systems. Some energy experts believe this rate of return approach is flawed because it encourages utilities to spend excessive amounts on equipment and power lines. Consumer groups add that the rate of return should be lowered. Most shareholder-owned utilities in this country earn profits for their shareholders based on how much infrastructure that they build and how expensive that infrastructure is, said a managing director at RMI, a nonprofit research organization formerly known as the Rocky Mountain Institute. There is a natural mismatch of incentives. Consumer Watchdog, a nonprofit that works on state policies, said utility returns have grown over the last 40 years to a level that is more than twice the interest paid by the 10-year U.S. Treasury note, which is around 4%, now lowering utility returns to between 6.5% and 7.5%. Consumer Watchdog said would still grant utilities significant profits while helping consumers. 2. California Give Consumers Rebates. ROSEP view to help consumers with their utility bills, give them a bill credit. In California, since 2014, there has been a fee imposed on greenhouse gas emissions of utility companies. This has delivered $14.6 billion in rebates to resident utility consumers since 2014. The former Democratic governor of Michigan advises the newly elected governor of Maryland to ask utilities to squeeze more efficiency out of the current system and then share the economic benefits with utility consumers by lowering their bills. Excerpts edited by ROSEP for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates, a 501c3 nonprofit organization. The New York Times, January 31st, 2026. Last year, California issued refunds averaging $198 to nearly 12 million residential utility customers. Such credits are one of the fastest ways to help consumers if you want to go as quickly as possible, said the representative of the group of Energy Assistance Group directors. Give them a bill credit. You do not have to give them to everybody. Since 2014, the California Cap and Invest program, which seeks to address climate change by imposing a fee on greenhouse gas emissions, has delivered $14.6 billion in rebates to residents. This year, California will provide $1.4 billion for electricity customers, $1 billion for natural gas customers, and $122 million for small businesses. The refunds range from $35 to $259 on electric bills. California issued 2 last year. In April and October, there are easy fixes to save billions of dollars from utilities, said the president of Consumer Watchdog, which is based in Los Angeles. But utility executives said that such proposals would undermine a business model the industry has relied on for decades to secure the investment to maintain the grid. The winter storm is a timely reminder that the electric grid is the most important machine in America, and we have to make sure it works reliably every day for families, businesses, and local communities, said the president and chief executive of the Edison Electric Institute. The predictability and stability of financing are vitally important in all state regulatory environments to attract the capital needed to strengthen the grid and responsibly meet the growing demand for electricity. Some energy experts said states have another option: change how utilities make money. Governors and legislatures could direct regulators to encourage utilities to save money, said Jennifer Granholm, who is the energy secretary in the Biden administration. States could, for for example, allow utilities to earn a return on spending that helps them do more with what they have already built, squeeze more efficiency out of the existing system, and share the benefits with the ratepayers, said Ms. Granholm, a former Michigan governor who has advised Gov. Mikey Sherrill of New Jersey. 3A Illinois Superfund laws already passed in New York and Vermont Make Polluters Pay is a week of action across the country, including in the states of Connecticut, Colorado, California, New Jersey, and Maine, making fossil fuel polluters pay amid national call to make polluters pay. Illinois lawmakers are prepping a climate change Superfund bill as climate costs rise and the federal U.S. backslides on action pressure mounts on states to fill the gaps. Excerpts. Edited by ROSEP for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates, a 501c3 nonprofit organization. The New York Times, January 28, 2026. Pro-fossil fuel pollution Trump and Republicans join the big oil all-out push to shut down climate liability efforts. Illinois lawmakers plan to introduce a climate change Superfund bill in the state legislature this session, the latest in a growing number of states seeking to make fossil fuel companies pay up for the fast-growing financial fallout of climate change as the costs of global warming rise in the form of home insurance premiums, utility bills, health expenses, and record-breaking damages from extreme weather. Local advocates are increasingly pushing states to require that fossil fuel companies contribute to climate superfunds that would support mitigation and adaptation. Illinois State Rep. Robin Gable, who will introduce the bill in the House, said she is motivated by the growing threat of flooding and heat waves in the state. The costs with climate change are going to be extravagant, and it is going to end up on the backs of the taxpayers, and the oil companies continue to walk away with huge profits, said Gable. In Evanston, Democrat polluting companies should be responsible for the damage they cause. 3B Illinois, the Make Polluters Pay Movement. Excerpts edited by ROSEP for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates, a 501c3 nonprofit organization. The New York Times, January 28, 2026. Advocates will rally on Thursday morning in Chicago to support what is known as the Make Polluters Pay effort as part of a national week of action, with climate activists and disaster survivors holding events across the country, including in Connecticut, Colorado, California, New Jersey, and Maine. 2 states, New York and Vermont, have already passed climate Superfund laws. Meanwhile, the U.S. has just officially exited the Paris Climate Agreement, the latest in the continued backsliding on climate progress by the Trump federal government and ongoing cuts to the Federal Emergency Management Agency put increasing strain on states and cities. Advocates and some Democratic lawmakers are pushing states to fill the gap. It is time for us to step up, said the director of Midwest Environmental Health at the Natural Resources Defense Council and a member of the coalition fighting for the Illinois bill. We are a blue state, so we need to implement ways to improve infrastructure and health and combat climate change. 3C Illinois legal challenges to the Make Polluters Pay movement. Even outside Illinois, the New York and Vermont laws are both facing legal challenges from the fossil fuel industry and the U.S. Department of Justice. The agency, which called the measures burdensome and ideologically motivated, has also sought to block Michigan and Hawaii from suing fossil fuel companies to pay for climate costs like adaptive infrastructure or public health interventions. The American Petroleum Institute included fighting Superfund legislation in its list of 2026 priorities, claiming the laws would bypass Congress and threaten affordability. The communications director for fossil-free media and the Make Polluters Pay campaign said that advocates are not deterred. We recognize that this is a David versus Goliath fight, but we are not going to back down. She said it is what the majority of the population wants, and it is something that is simple and fair and makes a lot of sense. The rising costs of climate change. Last year, the nonprofit Climate Central launched an online database to track the most costly weather and climate-related disasters across the country. The effort was led by the same lead scientist who tracked those costs for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration until the Trump administration axed the project in May 2025. In 2025, the U.S. experienced 23 such disasters with costs totaling at least $1 billion for a total of $115 billion. Climate Central concluded from 1980 through 2025, the U.S. has experienced $426 billion weather and climate disasters for a total of more than $3.1 trillion in damages. 3D Illinois Affordability Crisis from Costly Climate Change Effects on Utility Consumers. Excerpts edited by ROSEP for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates, a 501c3 nonprofit organization. The New York Times, January 28, 2026. Meanwhile, home insurance rates are rising and insurance companies are increasingly backing out of areas with high risks from hurricanes or wildfires. Researchers have also documented how climate change causes premature deaths and increasing healthcare costs as it fuels disease and other health problems. Illinois is struggling with worsening flooding, heat waves, and air pollution, including from Canadian wildfires, all bring heavy costs. State Son Graciela Guzman, a Chicago Democrat who will introduce the Superfund legislation in the Illinois State Senate, said the bill is a practical step to bring funding to local schools, families, and governments already struggling with these consequences. This bill is about setting a fairer standard for who pays when climate damage hits our towns and neighborhoods, Guzman wrote in an email. The basement in her home on the southeast side of Chicago was flooded on and off with sewage water for a week last summer when her sewer line broke during a rainstorm that caused severe flash flooding throughout the city. Her home insurance would not cover the thousands of dollars it took to repair it. She said she sees it as an example of what the effort to make polluters pay could address. This Superfund climate bill would create revenue to fix the infrastructure people were looking at, their insurance bills they were looking at, their utility bills they were seeing, the costs of climate damage, and also everyday climate costs just really rising. They wanted some accountability. For a Maine onshore wind power, onshore wind power will be generated in northern Maine, but for use for which parts of Maine? Maine again looks north for onshore wind, but full grid integration will have to wait. The Trump antipathy for wind power is only one obstacle the proposal must overcome. Another involves who will benefit from the project in far northern Maine, where the power will be generated but not used. Excerpts edited by ROSEP for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates, a 501c3 nonprofit organization inside Climate. New January 30 2026 new wind projects could be coming to northern Maine, just not new power. The Maine Public Utilities Commission (PUC) has released a final request for proposals (RFP) for up to 1,200 megawatts MW of new onshore wind or other renewable generation enough to power nearly 450,000 homes, plus a new transmission line to carry that power to southern Maine and New England. Maine has been trying for years to build new renewable generation in its most remote northern counties. Aroostook and Washington, an area with enormous potential wind and biomass resources, but one that due to a historic quirk of grid architecture is electrically disconnected from the rest of New England, with the effort facing headwinds ranging from a hostile presidential administration to local opposition to transmission. The destination for the power could become the thorniest issue of all. The current RFP is the second time the PUC has put this proposal out to bid since Maine passed a law directing it to do so in 2021, although the PUC selected winning bidders in early 2023. That effort fell apart amid disagreements with the transmission developer over the cost and route of the proposed transmission line. 4B Maine Northern Maine and its relationship with Nova Scotia Canada. Former Maine Senate President Troy Jackson, who represented the northern half of Aroostook County until 2024 and is now running in the Democratic primary to be the next governor of Maine, was a key sponsor of the 2021 legislation. Jackson chose not to require that his district share in the power because he did not want to include anything that becomes a poison pill in an effort that was already likely to be controversial. Aroostook County and much of Washington County, which for simplicity could be called Northern Maine, are unique among New England regions in not being part of the New England transmission grid. They have no current direct physical connection to it and are not within the jurisdiction of the regional transmission operator ISO New England. Instead, the Northern Maine Independent System Administrator NMISA oversees local transmission and coordinates with the New Brunswick Power grid operator in Canada to balance load in the region. Generators in Northern Maine can send power to New England through New Brunswick in Canada and vice versa, practice known as wheeling. But the additional transmission costs tend to be prohibitive. The proposed transmission line would bring the region one step closer to joining New England electrically, but because that line will only carry power in one direction, it will not on its own lead to full integration or provide new power to Northern Maine. Jackson and other backers have focused on the economic benefits the project would bring to an area with unemployment rates among the highest in Maine and average household income among the lowest. Those benefits, they say, include jobs, funding for government services, and perhaps even property tax relief. Yet electricity prices are for many an even hotter topic than jobs or taxes. Average household electricity bills in much of the region have increased by at least 67% in the last 5 years, and after coming down some the last couple years, spiked again this month. Rates paid by manufacturing plants and other larger power consumers have also soared. A proposed data center in the region could further exacerbate these issues. In recent years, Northern Maine has obtained most of its electricity from New Brunswick Energy Marketing, a private energy broker arm of the New Brunswick Power Corporation. NBP, a utility owned by the Canadian province of New Brunswick. A recent surge in distributed solar generation means Northern Maine can now produce enough power to exceed demand on the sunniest of days, leading the country in the ability to supply peak demand with distributed solar power, according to Versant, the local utility. But at other times, the region gets most of its power from New Brunswick. That fact ruffles some local feathers. I do not particularly like getting our power from Canada. Aroostook County Administrator Ryan Pelletier said, because you are beholden to another entity that you have absolutely no political influence or negotiation power with, as tensions between the U.S. and Canada have grown over the past year due to the Trump tariffs and talk of making the entirety of Canada a 51st state. Public speculation about New Brunswick cutting off that power as a bargaining chip in a potential trade war has only heightened those concerns. 4C Maine, a potential wind powerhouse. Excerpts edited by Rozep for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates. A 501c3 nonprofit organization inside Climate. New January 30th, 2026. Northern Maine has the consistent winds, wood waste from timber and paper operations, and open space to sustainably meet more of its power needs, but with low levels of local demand and without additional transmission capacity to export power to New England. Further development of those abundant resources has been stymied. In 2023, the PUC selected a single massive wind farm on about 175,000 acres of timberland west of Holton as the winning generation bid, though that selection was canceled along with the transmission line. Representatives for Long Road Energy, the developer of that King Pine project, were reviewing the latest RFP and expect to prepare a new bid. Wind turbines are a familiar sight to locals. There are already several large installations in the southern part of the region with a collective nameplate capacity of roughly 500 megawatts MW, but the Mars Hill project, which sells its power to New Brunswick Power in Canada and BP, provide energy to the New England grid, feeding power into a transmission line running south from Canada. However, generation is often curtailed at these plants, meaning they produce less power than they otherwise would due to bottlenecks in the transmission system, said Francis Polaro, president of Renew Northeast, a nonprofit alliance of renewable energy companies and environmental nonprofits. Over the years, developers have signed preliminary land leases, mostly with timber companies, to build several other large wind farms, including the aforementioned King Pine, but none of those projects got off the ground, hampered by the same transmission constraints as existing projects that led to the current combined generation and transmission procurement. For Maine Who Benefits, excerpts edited by Rozep for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates. A 501c3 nonprofit organization inside Climate. New January 30th, 2026. Although environmental advocates tout the climate benefits of wind power, they have largely focused their arguments in support of this effort on energy affordability. We have always seen Maine wind as being the least cost source of new generation of any type in New England. Heather Sanborn, in her role as the state of Maine public advocate, is charged with representing the interests of ratepayers in PUC proceedings and said that energy affordability is a more salient concern these days than ever before. Although the transmission and generation developers selected through this process will rely on private financing for construction, ratepayers will eventually repay those costs via their utility bills. The question that Sanborn and ultimately the PUC will consider is, Whether the projects will unlock enough savings, for example, by generating cheaper power than existing sources and eliminating transmission bottlenecks to outweigh those costs, as well as who bears risk or potential reward. Sanborn said she is encouraged by the fact that compared to the prior bidding round, much more of what needs to be built in Maine will be regionalized in terms of the cost and shared amongst more of the New England states. That is due to two factors. First, those states have pooled their resources to build transmission upgrades from Pittsfield, Maine to southern New England in a parallel procurement led by ISO&E, cutting off a chunk of the transmission line from what will be built by the PUC procurement. 4. Maine, second, Vermont, Rhode Island, and Connecticut have joined Massachusetts and Maine in expressing interest in buying a portion of the new power generated via this Maine project. Excerpts edited by Rozep for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates, a 501c3 nonprofit organization inside Climate New January 30th, 2026. If they do, they will share in the transmission costs north of Pittsfield, Maine, as well. That greater regional interest does mean that less power could ultimately be available for Maine utilities to purchase via long-term contracts, also known as power purchase agreements (PPAs). While no distribution of power purchase rights has been agreed to yet, PUC Chair Phil Bartlett said that there is no minimum amount of power Maine would need to reserve in order for the PUC to approve a project. The directive is clear to get this line built. That is what the legislature wants to see, and we feel like we have flexibility in how to do that to maximize the benefit for Maine consumers. Bartlett said that is a problem for Jackson, the former Maine Senate president, who said that in light of the Trump multiple attempts to SDYMY offshore wind, he thinks Maine should try to hold on to all of the power from the project. If our goal is to get to 100% renewable energy, then I think we need to take all of this power because it is going to be the cheapest power. Yet renewable energy and affordability experts alike said that who takes the power via long-term contracts matters less than the overall downward pressure large wind projects generate on wholesale electricity prices. It is not really true that there would be less benefit for Mainers if Massachusetts is on the hook for some of the PPAs. The price suppressive effects are operating separate from that at the wholesale level, Sanborn said. Jack Shapiro of the Natural Resources Council of Maine explained those effects. 4. Maine Solar and Wind are the least expensive. Excerpts edited by Rozep for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates, a 501c3 nonprofit organization inside Climate New January 30th, 2026. To balance supply and demand in real time, ISO&E brings plants online in order from least to most expensive with next to no marginal cost. Renewables like solar and wind are typically the first to be brought online when the sun is shining and wind is blowing, so a large amount of new wind power can bump a costlier coal or gas plant out of the stack at many times throughout the year. This is especially valuable in winter when natural gas and wind speeds prices both tend to be higher than normal. Crucially, the price paid to the last plant brought online is the price to pay to all, and so these cost savings to all utilities in the region can be significant. Long-term contracts do matter to a degree, because as Jackson pointed out, they can lock utilities who sign them into a price below or above this wholesale market price, with ratepayers realizing the savings or additional costs. Grid ties will have to wait. Whatever this impact of the project on electricity prices in southern Maine and the rest of New England, it will likely not be felt by those living next to the new generation in northern Maine. Barry Hobbins, the Maine public advocate at the time the 2021 law was proposed, urged the legislature to keep some of the power local. There must be interconnection off ramps to allow for the use of power generated in Aroostook County be accessible and utilized by the people of Aroostook County. Hobbins testified, and the Jackson Senate colleague Trey Stewart, who represents the southern half of Aroostook County and is the current Senate minority leader, said, I was really hoping when we do a big infrastructure build like this that there would be an interconnection for the northern Maine Independent System Administrator, and yet that is not what we have in front of us. Bartlett and Jackson both said that whether fully integrating MISA into ISO&E would ultimately benefit local ratepayers was an open question in their minds, and in any case, not what the legislature directed via this procurement. It may be possible to build the sort of off-ramps suggested by Hobbins or otherwise isolate a portion of the power of a local generator to supply northern Maine without fully integrating into the New England grid. MISA CEO Dwayne Conley said he thought it was theoretically possible, but would need to be studied by engineers. But the RFP makes it extremely unlikely that anything of the sort happens with this project. A footnote clarifies that no interconnection to northern Maine is expected. The power squeeze. Stewart, minority leader of the Maine Senate, is among those who sees an urgency in greater integration, or at least competition. The Canadians have been absolutely screwing us on power. He said they generate hydro and coal across the border for the absolute share of lines of what they have. And yet when the natural gas market in New England started to spike, they stuck it to my constituents. Our costs are tied to electricity supply costs in the Northeast. New Brunswick Energy Marketing NBM Executive Director Rob Gillies said, adding, we always try to find the cheapest cost for our customers. Gillies said the electricity NBM supplies to northern Maine is a mix of surplus energy from New Brunswick Power and power purchased on the wholesale markets in the eastern United States and Canada. A stakeholder group of northern Maine utility businesses and government leaders convened by the Energy Office of the Governor in 2022 overwhelmingly identified too much market power given to New Brunswick and Quebec, which causes economic and technical risks to the MISA territory as a top concern, and additional in-region generation as one potential solution. Available data partially support these assertions. While overall household electric bills in much of northern Maine increased by at least 67% from 2020 to 2025, the bulk of that increase was due to increased distribution and transmission charges. The price for electricity supply alone, known as the standard offer rate, increased by about 35% in this time, which is roughly equivalent to the overall increases in power prices in New Brunswick over the same Period. Yet it is true that precisely in the years that gas and oil prices spiked from 2022 to 2023, a much larger share of the power in BP supplied to Northern Maine came from gas and oil plants, according to public disclosures by the Maine PUC. 4G Maine Affordability in Northern Maine compared to the new Brunswick Province of Canada. Excerpts edited by ROSAP for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates. A 501c3 nonprofit organization. Inside Climate New January 30th. 2026 Northern Maine standard offer ratepayers saw larger electricity supply cost increases in these years than New Brunswick ratepayers. We would never serve an export customer if it would negatively impact reliability or rates for New Brunswick customers, Gillies said, but said he could not comment on the specific generation mix reported by the PUC. Local perceptions, prices, and turbines going up at the same time does not sit well with residents of Aroostook County. People are seeing their electricity bills go up and up and up, and meanwhile there are all these projects getting built, and they are not seeing any benefit from it. Josh Davis, a resident of Monticello and substitute teacher, said. Davis added that he supports Windpower, but felt that the state was going about it the wrong way. Similarly, Lonnie Sorois, executive director of the Central Aroostook Chamber of Commerce, which convened a series of local discussions on energy in 2023, said she hears the question, why is it built here if the power is going to be shipped somewhere else? All the time from community members that skepticism is not universal. Pelletier said he hopes Northern Maine one day gets a share of any new power, but acknowledged that was not guaranteed or even likely with this project. Yet he said he supports the project anyway based on the jobs, local tax revenues, and community benefits package mandated at $4,000 per wind turbine per year under state law. It would bring Luke Nadeau is from the town of Oakfield home to the Oakfield Wind Farm and still lives in Northern Maine. He said that the $2,300 annual deduction in property taxes year-round Oakfield residents receive under an economic benefits agreement with the developer of the project was of huge help to his extended family, and that he supports further wind development. 4H Maine on Wednesday, January 28, 2026, a Superfund bill in Maine was voted out of committee and will proceed to a full vote in the state Senate. Excerpts edited by ROSAP for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates. A 501c3 nonprofit organization, the New York Times, January 28, 2026. It only makes sense as our bills get higher and we pay the price for climate change that polluters, the oil and gas industry, pay their fair share as well. Ramirez said climate Superfund bills are based on the premise that the companies most heavily contributing to the climate crisis should be on the hook to pay for its growing costs. The strategy pulls from the 1980 Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act, known as Superfund, which forces companies responsible for toxic contamination to pay for cleanup. The idea is broadly popular among the public according to polling by Data for Progress and Fossil-Free Media. They found that 71% of a national sample of likely voters were in favor of oil and gas companies paying a share of climate-related damages, but the bills have faced pushback from the Trump administration. For Maine The Election Ahead. Excerpts edited by ROSAP for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates. A 501c3 nonprofit organization. Inside Climate New January 30th, 2026. The conversation about energy is about to get louder. 2026 is a significant election year in Maine with races for governor, the U.S. Senate, and U.S. House all predicted to be hotly contested. The PUC bidding process for this project will unfold right in the middle of those. Campaigns bids are due in late February, and the PUC aims to select projects by the end of May. Northern Maine makes up a small share of the electorate, but it is disproportionately represented in these elections. U.S. Senator Susan Collins is from Aroostook County and has supported local wind power in the past, though she has not weighed in on this current effort, and her office did not respond to a request for comment. Her potential opponents vying for the Democratic nomination include current Governor Janet Mills, who has supported the Northern Maine energy effort, and longtime project champion Troy Jackson is running in a crowded Democratic primary to replace Mills. Recent state elections have proven the political salience of high energy costs, with Democrats able to successfully capitalize on the issue in 2025 after Republicans did so in 2024. In Maine, where the two parties have different prescriptions for getting power prices under control, who gets the power could be a question that helps swing an election. 5 Rhode Island. This month, a climate Superfund bill was introduced in Rhode Island. 6 Vermont. The Vermont Superfund Act. Excerpts edited by ROSAP for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates. A 501c3 nonprofit organization. Inside Climate New January 30th, 2026. Trump joins the opposition to the Vermont Climate Superfund Act, calling it burdensome and ideologically motivated despite limited interest in drilling on federal land. Forest Service streamlines oil and gas leasing rules. Vermont is against fossil fuel pollution, and along with New York passed climate Superfund laws last year, and similar legislation is pending in a handful of other states. 7 Washington, D.C. On Monday, a council member in Washington, D.C. announced a bill to study the financial impacts of climate change on the city and potentially require compensation from fossil fuel companies. 8 Wisconsin. Geothermal clean energy power. Excerpts edited by ROSAP for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates. A 501c3 nonprofit organization. Inside Climate News January 31st, 2026. The promising renewable energy that Democrats and Republicans actually agree on. The Epic corporate headquarters in Verona, Wisconsin, features a geothermal heating and cooling network buried beneath the buildings. 9 Australia. The offer of free electricity when there is a surplus. Excerpts edited by ROSAP for brevity and clarity in relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates. A 501c3 nonprofit organization. The New York Times, January 31st, 2026. Some customers in Australia will begin getting free electricity for 3 hours a day beginning in July. Much of Australia produces so much electricity, primarily from solar panels, during the day that the country plans to just give it away to residents beginning in July. Electricity customers in the states of New South Wales and South Australia and the region of southeast Queensland will receive free power for 3 hours during the day. The government hopes to offer the same break to to the rest of the country. By 2027, the government and its supporters contend that this approach can help residents and the electricity system. People can shift energy-intensive tasks like laundry or charging home batteries and electric cars to the designated 3 hours, and by giving away the electricity, power producers can avoid shutting down solar and wind farms or selling energy at a loss. That can be a way for people who are cost-conscious to save a little money, said Leah Stokes, an associate professor of political science at the University of California, Santa Barbara, who specializes in energy and environmental policy. Solar and wind producers in some parts of the United States also struggle with too much renewable energy during parts of the day. Some estimates indicate that about 10% of the solar energy produced across the country is not used. Ms. Stokes said some utility industry groups have objected to the plan of Australia, saying it could reduce industry profits and the incentive to invest in new electricity generation, power lines, and other equipment. They have also said the plan would mainly help affluent residents who own home batteries and electric vehicles. 10 Germany encourages home solar and batteries. Excerpts edited by Rozep for brevity and clarity. In relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates, a 501c3 nonprofit organization, the New York Times, January 31st, 2026. Taking a cue from Germany, lawmakers in roughly half of U.S. states have introduced legislation to make it legal for Americans to use plug-in solar, also known as balcony solar. These solar panels can be plugged into a normal wall socket and installed without an electrician or permission from local utilities. The systems are typically a lot cheaper than installing panels on rooftops, though they also generate less energy. It does not matter if it is portable and hanging off your balcony or bolted to your roof, said Bernadette Del Chiaro, a senior vice president at the Environmental Working Group. It is generating electricity and cutting your utility bills. Solar panels, batteries, and electric vehicles also can form what are known as virtual power plants, small systems linked together with software that can mimic large power plants. Broader use of such systems can avoid the need for new power plants and lines, while making the grid more resilient. Small systems also can be built a lot faster than natural gas and nuclear power plant. States can encourage more solar and battery systems at homes and businesses by making it much easier for property owners and installers to obtain building permits and permission to connect to the grid. Energy experts said, however, the Trump administration has sought to stall renewable energy projects and increase the use of coal, natural gas, and oil. Some Republicans like Neil Chatterjee, who led the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission during part of the Trump first term, say government officials ought to embrace an all-of-the-above approach to energy as electricity prices continue to rise. Solar is just going to be a cheaper alternative for residents than the bills they are paying for their utilities. He said, we cannot possibly do this with fossil fuels alone. 11 Russian oil revenue, the lifeblood of its war machine, is plummeting. The new reality has forced the Kremlin to raise taxes and increase debt, and hovers over peace talks with Ukraine. The steep drop in oil revenue has sent Russia into a new era of sustained budget deficits, higher taxes, and stubborn inflation. Excerpts edited by Rozep for brevity and clarity. In relationship to residents against wood smoke emission particulates, a 501c3 nonprofit organization. The New York Times, January 31st, 2026. As Russia holds direct peace talks with Ukraine for the first time in months, the most potent fuel for the Kremlin for the war, oil revenue, is under mounting strain. The price of Russian oil, the Russian primary export, has declined under the weight of surging global supplies and Western sanctions related to the war. Last year, Russian oil and gas revenue fell by almost a quarter, according to the finance ministry. The Kremlin is resorting to tax increases and deficit spending to bridge the gap. So far, there is little sign that the economic strains and any discontent they generate among business leaders and the public will be enough to change Putin. Calculations on the war. Trilateral negotiations involving Russia, Ukraine, and the United States are set to continue on Sunday in Abu Dhabi, the capital of the United Arab Emirates. But with the economy stagnating and the Kremlin reaching the limit of what it can squeeze from it, the Russian people will have to bear more of the burden of a war whose costs exceed about $170 billion a year. This situation is manageable, said Yevgeny Nadershin, an economist in Moscow who advises companies and banks, but no one is comfortable with that. Throughout his decades-long rule, Putin has taken pride in the stability he has brought to a Russian economy that was in free fall after the demise of the Soviet Union. Slashing debt, streamlining taxes, and taming inflation. A strong oil economy allowed the Russian state to deliver an improved standard of living that the Kremlin hoped would keep the public content even as the government eroded personal freedoms. Now the carefully cultivated economic stability is fracturing. The steep drop in oil revenue has sent Russia into a new era defined by sustained budget deficits, higher taxes, and stubborn inflation. Russian oil trade has been battered by two forces. Oil prices have declined since April after the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries OPEC decided to gradually increase production after years of cuts. The Russian oil industry has also been hit in recent months by new Western sanctions and the heavier enforcement of existing ones. In October, President Trump imposed sanctions on the two largest oil companies in Russia, Rosneft, which is state-owned, and Lukoil, which is private. Those penalties significantly undercut the ability of companies to sell crude. Since then, Russia has also faced stepped-up enforcement of restrictions against the illicit shadow fleet of tankers it uses to ship oil. This month, the U.S. military seized a Russian-flagged vessel in the North Atlantic that had been used to carry Venezuelan oil. Because of the current global oversupply, buyers now have more alternatives to Russian crude. This allows them to either walk away entirely or demand significantly higher discounts to compensate for the risk of handling goods hit with sanctions, said Sergei Vakulenko, an energy expert at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Had it not been for this noticeable decrease in oil prices, he said, all these measures would have been far less effective. Discounts on Russian oil have grown drastically. The economy ministry said this month that the average price of Russian oil was $39 per barrel in December, down from more than $57 in August. Adding to the problems of Moscow, now Ukraine has been using drones since November to strike Russia-linked tankers in the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. The Ukrainian military has also been attacking Russian refineries. That has contributed to fuel crises in several regions, forcing the government to temporarily ban The export of oil products, the only factor that can change the situation, is economic pressure on Russia. President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine said on Friday Russia must run out of money for the war to start coming to an end. This is not the first time that Putin has dealt with a drop in oil prices, but in previous years the Russian state had more options. It could cut expenditures or allow the currency to weaken to replenish the budget, but the costs of the war, which amount to about 30% of the Russian $580 billion annual budget, make it hard to reduce expenses, and the currency, the ruble, has remained strong, propped up by restrictions on imports and high interest rates. The ruble surged by about 45% against the US dollar in 2025. A strong ruble means that the government receives less money for each barrel of crude that is sold, with options dwindling. The Kremlin had little choice but to increase state debt, as well as personal and corporate taxes. The Russian government also increased taxes on smaller enterprises like bakeries and shops, causing a rare uproar among owners. The Russian budget deficit reached $72 billion in 2025, nominally the highest since 2009. Mr. Nadershin, the economist, said he expected it to increase further this year. The situation is becoming more complicated, he said, and it is clear that the pace of this complication is naturally worrying. Webisode 57DHYAFZXV. January 11, 2026. Congress is racing to undo thousands of cuts to federal science programs. Cartoon 1 of 5. Congress is racing to undo thousands of cuts to federal science programs. Cell 1. The current government bid for an overall cut in scientific funding to $154 billion from $198 billion would be a plunge of 22%. Cell 2. This week, the Senate Appropriations Committee released a bipartisan package of bills. Cell 3 that largely scraps the current government-planned cuts to federal science programs. Cell 4. Congress will set aside roughly $188 billion for federal research. Cartoon 2 of 5. Congress is racing to undo thousands of cuts to federal science programs. Cell 1. $188 billion for federal research will only be a drop of 4%. Cell 2. This rejects the current government push to let our competitors do laps around us. Cell 3. Last year, the current government administration called for a cut in federal basic research of more than 1/3. Cell 4. The current government sought even larger cuts for the National Science Foundation, which sponsors much of the nation's basic research. Cartoon 3 of 5. Congress is racing to undo thousands of cuts to federal science programs. Cell 1. The current government proposed that the National Science Foundation NSF budget be slashed to $3.9 billion. Cell 2. From $8.8 billion, a drop of 56%. Cell 3. The Senate package countered with a reduction to $8.75 billion. Cell 4, or less than 1%. Cartoon 4 of 5. Congress is racing to undo thousands of cuts to federal science programs. Cell 1. The Senate package includes $24.4 billion for NASA, a 1.6% cut. Cell 2. $8.8 billion for the Environmental Protection Agency (EPA), a 4% cut. Cell 3. $8.4 billion for the Department of Energy Office of Science, a 1.9% increase. Cell 4. $6.2 billion for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, roughly flat. Cartoon 5 of 5. Congress is racing to undo thousands of cuts to federal science programs. Cell 1. The Senate and the House are now not far apart for negotiations on a final budget. Cell 2. The House's moves on 2026 science budgeting add up to $185 billion, which is close to the Senate figure of $188 billion. Cell 3. But this cannot undo the damage that the current government administration frenzy of budget cutting and administrative chaos. Cell 4 brought to the nation's scientific establishment.
Webisode 57DHYAFZXV. January 11, 2025. If science funds are restored, then fund alternatives to wood burning. Cartoon 1 of 5. If science funds are restored, then fund alternatives to wood burning. Cell 1. Fund heat pumps that work down to 40 degrees below zero and also act as air conditioners. Cell 2. Fund extending a smart electric grid everywhere, including all rural areas. Cell 3. Fund wind and solar energy sources that produce electricity sent to the smart grid. Cell 4. Fund batteries that store the electricity produced by wind and solar long-term for use in emergencies. Cartoon 2 of 5. If science funds are restored, then cut dirty energy that is now funded. Cell 1. Cut funds for biofuels such as wood stoves and wood burning for home heating. Cell 2. Cut funds for biofuels such as corn-based ethanol for automobile fuel. Cell 3. Cut funds for wood and other biofuels used to replace coal burning in industrial plants. Cell 4 cut funds for fossil fuels as well as cut funds for biofuels. Cartoon 3 of 5 If science funds are restored, enact regulations that fund removal of indoor residential wood-burning appliances. Cell 1 fund resident-owned Purple Air PM 2.5 monitors. Cell 2 given free to any near neighbor of an indoor residential wood burner. Cell 3 whose wood-burning PM 2.5 emissions enter the yard of the near neighbor and sicken them. Cell 4 use the data downloadable from the Purple Air map as evidence to shut down each indoor residential wood-burning appliance, one appliance at a time if necessary. Cartoon 4 of 5 If science funds are restored, enact regulations that make electric vehicles and public transport affordable. Cell 1 reinstate rebates for electric vehicles. Cell 2 fund high-speed electric transport that will be low cost to all. Cell 3 enact fuel regulations to discourage production of gas-powered vehicles. Cell 4 fund research that makes production of electric vehicles efficient and cost-effective. Cartoon 5 of 5 If science funds are restored, enact regulations that make home heating and transport by electric vehicle affordable. Cell 1 do not allow subsidies for luxury electric vehicles. Cell 2 do not allow subsidies for home heating for individuals making over a certain salary. Cell 3 tax the rich to provide clean energy subsidies for the middle income and poor. Cell 4 keep in mind that the Energy Department and the EPA should work to stop air pollution that harms human health as well as slow climate change.
Webisode 57DHYAFZXV January 4th, 2026 Would smoke affect the family adversely? Cartoon 1 of 2 Cell 1 When you know you are not protecting your family well enough. When you replace air filters and air purifiers every month instead of every 6 months. Just do not burn wood indoors residentially to begin with. Cell 2 When you are scared whenever someone opens a window. Just do not burn wood indoors residentially to begin with. Cartoon 2 of 2 Cell 1 It gives me no great joy to say this. Smog towers do not work. Cell 2 Carbon capture does not work. Just do not burn wood industrially in place of coal to begin with.
Red Green Fox here. The quick Red Green Fox jumped over the barriers to clean air. Red Green Fox here. Ready to sing to you the names of the 2025 major wood-burning biomass industry subsidy opponents. 1 Biofuel Watch. 2 Bulkley Valley Stewardship Coalition of British Columbia, Canada. 3 Kommite Schoen Luft, which means Beautiful Air Committee in German. 4 Dogwood Alliance. 5 Equity Group Foundation, nicknamed EGF. 6 Environmental Paper Network, nicknamed EPN. 7 Natural Resources Defense Council, nicknamed NRDC. 8 Prakaunia Narzexwisistik Istit, which means Workshop for All Beings in Polish. 9 Rachel Carson Council. 10 Solutions for Our Climate, nicknamed SFOC.
Cat's corner strategy with Tiger and Leone. Saying the quiet part out loud. Roar. Hi, I am Tiger. Our human asked us to get up from our naps and start Cat's Corner strategy with Tiger and Leone. She gave us a list of internet allies which we will post for her here.
Hi, I am Leone. It is better for your mental fitness to go to these websites than to go to bro sites for advice. Substack letters from an American Heather Cox Richardson. Substack your local epidemiologist. The Midas Touch. The Guardian. The New York Times.
One introduction. View. The United States government was on track in the Biden administration to reduce the prices for both clean energy heat pumps and clean energy electric cars. Trump tariffs are expected to upset those plans to prevent future air pollution and prevent climate change. The United States government should, instead of certifying wood stoves as safe when they are not safe, go forward with regulations that ban wood stove use and direct government money for use of forest refuse only for home building and furniture building. For just a few examples of use of forest products for non-burning uses, it is well known from scientific and medical research that wood burning is a substantial source of PM 2.5 emissions, yet the wood burning industry uses the scientifically debunked theory named carbon neutrality of wood burning to argue that wood burning replacing coal burning in industry, and in a trickle-down argument that wood burning should continue for home heating should continue. Presumably because it is called renewable, wood may be renewable in the sense that a tree can be planted in the place of a cut-down burned tree. But it takes centuries or decades for the newly planted tree to attain the stature of the cut-down burned tree. During those centuries or decades, photosynthesis, which converts CO2 to oxygen, and so sequesters some carbon, will not take place at the same rate as photosynthesis was performed previously, and wood burning emits both CO2 and PM 2.5, and PM 2.5 is Not absorbed by trees, so PM 2.5 is not diminished by planting a tree in the place of a cut down and burn tree. In fact, a living tree closes its pores against the presence of PM 2.5 from nearby wood burning, just as humans hold their breath in the presence of PM 2.5 from nearby wood burning. And when a tree closes its pores, the level of photosynthesis that absorbs CO2 pollution goes down. Wood burning emits 90% PM 2.5 particulate matter of 2.5 micrometer size, the perfect size to infiltrate the human lung, setting off a cascade of human health problems and early deaths. Contrary to many beliefs, wood burning emits 2.8 times the PM 2.5 as the fossil fuel coal burning, and wood burning emits 450 times the PM 2.5 as the fossil fuel natural gas burning. Replacing coal burning with wood burning creates more air pollution in the form of CO2 and PM 2.5 than coal burning. This emission data comes from testing the cleanest burning wood stove in the United Kingdom, the Eco-Design Wood Stove International Convention does not count the emissions from wood burning. The emissions from wood burning are erased from all countries around the world when calculating if each country has met its climate goals. This non-counting or erasure of wood burning emissions data from climate goals does not mean wood burning emissions do not exist. ROSEPView purple air PM 2.5 monitors hanging from the eaves of the house of a near neighbor should be used to measure the level of PM 2.5 in the air hyperlocally in the yards of near neighbors of indoor residential wood burners. If PM 2.5 levels exceed World Health Organization standards of 5 micrograms per cubic meter annually, then that evidence of air pollution from wood burning should lead to the shutdown of that indoor residential wood burning appliance, one appliance at a time if necessary.